I'm Mindy Peterson, and this is Enhanced Life with Music, where we explore the ways music makes our lives better and spotlight the resources you can use to enhance your life with music. I'm delighted to have a fellow Minnesotan as my guest today. Dr. Anton Treuer is professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University. He has presented internationally on topics related to tribal sovereignty, history, language, and culture. Dr. Treuer has won numerous awards and written many books, including Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. That particular book is also available in a young reader's edition. I am thrilled to have him join us today to talk about the role of music in Native American culture. Welcome to Enhanced Life with Music, Anton.
Thank you so much for having me on.
It's great to have you. I loved your book. Very well done. Highly recommend that. And I know we'll be talking about that in the context of our conversation today. I know that there are many Native American tribes over vast areas of North America, Central America, South America. But recognizing this, what can you tell us historically about the role that music has played in traditional Native American life? And I'd love to know, too, how that has changed or remained the same today, if you want to address that separately or in the context of your answer to the first question.
Sure. So, first of all, something that'll be important for your listeners to know is that Native people are internally diverse. So just like you wouldn't say, tell me about white music. Well, what part of white music and when and where? Because there's so much variation within white music. And it's the same for Native music. So, we have here in the United States, 574 federally recognized tribes. And you have many hundreds of First Nations in Canada. And then as you go south, into Mexico, Central and South America, you have so many different tribes with many very different musical traditions. I happen to be Ojibwe. My family comes from Leech Lake in northern Minnesota, and I'm very familiar with the musical traditions of our people because I sing and officiate at ceremonies and things like that. And we have many different kinds of music, even in Ojibwe space. So there's love music, so traditional Ojibwe flute and vocal songs with drums and rattles, just for courtship and fun and entertainment. We have ceremonial music, many different kinds, and I'm happy to share a little more about some of what that landscape looks like. There are active ceremonial drums in many of the communities across the entire region. And sometimes those ceremonies have many hundreds of people who attend. So I have positions on 4 ceremonial drums where I help as what they call the big stick. I'm kind of in charge of all the singers on one of them. I'm a singer on another, and I actually do a lot of talking on another one. So, it's different for me in different places, but those musical and artistic traditions are very much alive. It's sometimes hard for people outside of an indigenous culture to understand what's happening inside of that culture. And so maybe a couple things that'll be helpful for folks listening today is, number one, all cultures change over time. And there's no stopping that from happening. If you ever try to read Geoffrey Chaucer, he's known as one of the first guys who tried to write down stories in the English language. I had to read him in high school. I don't know if they assign him anymore, but I could barely read that stuff. The way it's spelled, the way it's pronounced. And he was writing only 600 years ago. And English is a commonly spoken language in lots of publications and movies and music, and it changes that much that fast. So that happens for everybody. I think even the Amish struggle to go Amish or stay Amish. They lose people every year. It's hard to wall off a culture, a musical tradition, and freeze it in time. I mean, you can have recordings and you can have scores of Mozart and look at 600 different pieces of music he created, and it does show you something. but even how we would record it or play it today is different from how it was done in his time. And you almost have to imagine the environment for chamber music, for example, because we don't have the same political, musical, and social environments. So for Ojibwe people, much the same. For example, as happens, I think, with every culture on planet Earth, there is a percussion, right? So the use of drums. And it's interesting, in the Ojibwe language, our word for drum is deweagun, and de means heart, and we means sound. So the word deweagun describes a heartbeat. And so there are different types of beats in Ojibwe music, but one is the syncopated beat for, Ojibwe social dances. And people will get up and dance and move around the drum. So it's like symbolically the heartbeat of the people. Mm-hmm. And ceremonial drums would be placed in the middle and people move around those. And all of that's kind of reflected in the language and the customs around, that music. There are many different types of, even beats and types of singing that you'll hear even at a ceremonial drum. And all of this informed like what you might see at a modern day powwow. So the modern day powwow has kind of elements from a number of different tribes, including Ojibwe ceremonial culture around this, but it's more of a secular event. It is ancient, but it is modern too. And by that I mean there was, for example, an ancient custom amongst many of the Plains tribes and amongst the Great Lakes, where people had to earn their eagle feathers through acts of service to the people. And the powwow regalia, which often displays many eagle feathers, all had to be earned, and often earned through military deeds and things like that. So the traditional powwow regalia and the music that goes with it really comes from ancient warrior societies of the plains, and it kind of became stylized. But if you took somebody from, the year 1800 and transported them through time to watch a modern day powwow, and they were looking at a 12-year-old kid displaying a bunch of eagle feathers, they would say, that is the toughest kid I have ever seen. He must have killed so many people. But, today the earning of eagle feathers is done through other kinds of acts of service. They're still considered sacred and important. We're still dancing to some of the same songs and some of the same rituals, but the meaning ascribed to them has shifted and changed. And it would be common that somebody would use some modern technologies in the construction of musical instruments or, dance regalia. So Europeans had glass beads, and Native people in our area used porcupine quills and moose hair to do embroidery. But when they got trade beads, they automatically adapted the traditional Ojibwe floral patterns to the use of beadwork. And at a modern powwow, you see lots of beads. So it is ancient. It is our ancient custom and tradition, but some of the materials are modern, mm-hmm. And so it's probably like that with so many different traditions. And other things that have happened, we still sing songs that, have the Ojibwe words in there. Ojibwe is a living language. But you will find for like what they call 49 songs, people are singing in English for those songs too. So you'll see some hybrid uses of language. And then, of course, there are Native hip hop artists. There are all kinds of things. Native people have made the modern music that you know and love in many different ways, and it's not just a all Native band, singing "Come and Get Your Love," although that was an all Native band that came up with that song, and Native musicians right out of Native communities. Even Link Ray, who is a famous guitarist, he was actually the first modern musician who had his music banned, but had no lyrics in the music.
And where was it banned?
It was banned in the United States.
Because?
Too radical and firing up young people and causing a revolution.
So with the beat?
With his guitar playing. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
And if anyone who's listening is curious to know more about like native influence in modern music that everybody's listening to, you might check out the documentary Rumble, The
Okay.
Indians Who Rocked the World. And it does a great job of showing how native people have influenced modern music. And
Ah,
sometimes there are surprises, like the native population actually has the highest rate of marriage to people from outside groups. So the native population is especially multiracial. Even Jimi Hendrix was native.
okay.
He was native and black. And and so a lot of people don't know that stuff.
Right.
Because one of the things that happens in the native experience, sometimes we experience hyper visibility, racial profiling or something, but a lot of times we experience invisibility and marginalization. So the contributions or even presence of native people is not always on the radar screen. And I think part of that is because most Americans are so conditioned to think that natives are something that happened in the past.
Mm.
Like 87% of the educational standards that mention native people are stories from before 1900.
Yeah.
And so I've had people say things to me, especially when I travel in the American South or the East, where a lot of the native population got moved to Oklahoma. And people have said things to me like, it's a shame they killed all the Indians. And I'm saying, hold on a minute. I'm feeling pretty good today. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think about that. And it's because they're conditioned to look for the beads and feathers. And like you stepped off the set from Dances with Wolves, I happen to be pretty brown, and I have long hair. And I think I'm identifiably native, but at the same time, it just didn't occur to people. People would assume I was something else, anything else, you know,
Yeah.
Hispanic, Latino, Filipino, Arab, anything, unless I'm really showing beads and feathers, or singing a powwow song or something like that. And I'm like, oh, maybe that's a native person. And
Okay.
so there's more out there and more impact and influence than a lot of people know.
You mentioned drums, flute, voice. Are those sort of like the primary instruments that traditionally have been most used in Native American music, or are there other instruments that were real common historically?
Oh, there are quite a few others too. Rattles, drums, flute, and voice, I would say, are the most common and prolific across Native America. But like the Ojibwe did not have a stringed instrument. Some other, indigenous groups did. And yeah, there are many, many different types of music. Some have, you know, large groups of singers, what you might think of a little more like chanting or something like that. And even in Ojibwe culture, like when we're singing at a ceremonial drum or at a powwow, you might have, up to a dozen or sometimes as many as 20 people huddled together around one drum singing together. And there's a structure to the music where there's a lead, where one person sings solo. There's a second where everybody follows the lead together. And then there's a first half where usually it's just vocables without words. And then there's a second, verse that's got the words built in there together, lead, second, first and second verse. That is often called a push-up. And a song might be singing through 4 push-ups or 6 push-ups of that particular song. So there's a definitive structure and many people participating, but you might notice at points there's a solo singer, but it's not really considered a solo. They're leading that particular push-up of the song, and it might shift around from person to person throughout the song. There's a style to, the percussion too, with the use of accented beats. They often call honor beats. But when you step out from that, there are many other kinds of music. So both ceremonial and secular music where one person is singing by themselves, or where you might have a smaller group of people singing, or one person is singing the song and others will join in. Something else pretty common in music across the Great Lakes and the Plains is called a jabaway, where the singers are singing a song and someone will sing an octave above, accompanying the song. So it's not quite a harmony the way that you would think of it in modern music, but they're actually singing the same notes but an octave above.
Okay.
And so yeah, it just has a different sound. And there's sometimes even almost like a call and response in the music. So the lead, the second, the first verse, and then on the second verse, the singers around the drum drop their voices out, and the singers moving and dancing around them sing or job away above, and then they'll go back and forth. And so it's kind of like a call and respond between the singers and dancers. So you'll find many different types of music and structures to the music.
Interesting. Well, I know with pretty much all cultures, music is used in different ways for funerals, for holidays, cultural celebrations. You mentioned ceremonies, courtship or love songs, religious practice, battle, storytelling and history. I mean, there's so many different ways that music is used within all cultures. Are there any ways either that I mentioned or other ways, maybe education or diplomacy or other, healing ways that music just is really sort of a distinguishing factor within Native culture that you want to mention?
Oh yeah, I would say music in, our tribe is used in all of the ways that you described. So like even a traditional funeral, so like the instructions for at the funeral there's a lot of talking and a lot of singing. And so people eat with the departing soul, they give legends to the departing soul, they sing to the departing soul, so it's not just in memory of, but they're giving them something to take with them on their journey. And we use them for all kinds of ceremonial rites and healing. Like actually the first person who had been seated as a chief on the ceremonial drums, his son had died. And he said, see, it's bad luck. I don't want anything to do with this. I quit this ceremony. I'm going to leave. I don't want anything to do with it. And the people stopped him from leaving. And they grabbed him by the hand, almost like you would a little child. And they walked him around the drum and they brought him back to his chair. And the ancient custom at the time was when people were grieving or in mourning, they would take charcoal and rub some charcoal on their face, and they wouldn't show excessive vanity, like tightly braided hair. And so then they sat him down and they carefully washed all the charcoal off of his face, and they combed and rebraided his hair. And then they piled up gifts asking him to go on with life. And then they started to sing songs. And there were 4 songs they sang first, where each one of the warriors got up and danced around the drum and then danced around him, and then they wiped his tears. And then the second one did, and the third and the fourth. And then after that, they sung a 5th song, and they grabbed him by the arms and they lifted him up and they held him as they danced him around the drum, kind of like symbolically back into the circle of life to carry on with his duties and with life. And so today now, people usually don't rub charcoal on their faces or leave their hair unbraided if they're in mourning, but we do replicate the ceremony. So, I'd lost actually in recent years both of my parents, and each time they grabbed me by the hand like a little kid, they walked me around, seated me down at the drum, they washed my hair and combed my hair and washed my face and piled up gifts and asked me to carry on with life. And they had the warriors wipe my tears and lift me up and bring me back into the circle. And so I officiate at that ceremony for other people, and I've had it done for me when I've had losses. And be kind of, the music is how we tie people to the tradition and provide the healing rite and lift them up to carry on with life. And I found that very healing for me. And I found healing in it helping other people do it too.
I can imagine that being really touching. I was just hearing somebody talk yesterday about the power of just sitting on the same side of the table as somebody. And that action going along with their words of, we're on the same team here, we're in this together. And the words are great, but when you actually physically sit on the same side of the table, it can just further emphasize that. And what you're describing seems like it would have that same effect. I mean, you could hear people saying those words to you, but to have them physically take your hand and lead you back into the circle, I would think would be really powerful, especially at that time of grief and loss.
Oh yeah. And it's with everything, at the funerals too, the officiating crew doesn't preach to a captive audience. They sit with the family and they talk to the departing soul. So it's just much like you described, sitting on the same side of the table kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, music's infused into absolutely everything that we do. And so it's used for, in that case, a healing ceremony, helping people deal with grief and loss, or with a funeral. But it's, with all kinds of life ceremonies, initiations into sacred rites, secular and social music. I've been really impressed with something that's been happening in some of our communities, like Mille Lacs, for example, in central Minnesota, has built a beautiful ceremonial dance hall in each of their communities for their ceremonial drums. And on any given, Saturday night, when a lot of people maybe are looking for some fun or entertainment or a party, those ceremonial dance halls are full of people, hundreds of them, eating healthy food, moving around the drum, dancing to music, being in community, babies, adults, elders, everything in between, and the functions of like pulling community together and doing something healthy with regard to food and physical movement.
Uh-huh.
And, honoring our ancestors and traditions, and just laughing and having a wonderful time. And it's all tied together by the music.
Love that. Well, like I said, I loved your book. Your book didn't specifically talk a lot about music, but when I was reading chapter 6, it's on tribal languages. There were so many times as I was reading that I thought you could just substitute the word music for language in this situation. One of those sections of the chapter was talking about the benefits of tribal languages. You talk about how knowing more than one language enhances cognitive development, which music does the same thing. And as
Right.
many people think of music as a language. You also talk about how tribal languages are cornerstones of identity. And in your book, you say their use keeps us recognizable to our ancestors. They are defining features of nationhood. They are the only customary languages for many ceremonies, a gateway to spiritual understanding. And tribal languages encapsulate unique tribal worldviews. They define us as distinct peoples, end quote. So I thought that as I was reading that, I was just thinking, wow, I just feel like music could be substituted in there. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Oh, for sure. It's really interesting, and this might be a little weird way to come at it, but there's a book called Sapiens, Yuval Harari. He's an anthropologist, and he's trying to answer the question, like, why did sapiens win out? There were actually several different types of humans on planet Earth at the same time, sapiens, Neanderthals, and others. And it's really interesting, but he said throughout most of history, all the different types of humans, we lived kind of like apes, like groups of at most 150. And if it got any bigger than that, there'd be a fight and it would break into two different groups. And we never got bigger until the invention of fiction. And when we invented fiction, we could imagine community with the next group. And then we could go team up and commit genocide on the Neanderthals or do whatever. And there's actually a debate. Did we interbreed and just sapien DNA won out, or was there a genocide? And it might have been a little bit of both, but we're not 100% sure. But in any event, the things that unite us as humans and the things that divide us as humans are all imagined. The differences between races, instead of seeing the oneness. But the oneness, in spite of our differences, it is something that happens in our mind. And music, art, are things that transcend the divisions and make it easier to see and feel the oneness.
Beautiful. Mic drop. Love that. If you're a regular listener of this show, you know that my favorite energy bar is Jam Bar. One thing I love about Jam Bar is that the 4 original flavors are separate and distinct. Unlike some bars whose different flavors seem to all taste the same, there is no flavor fatigue with Jam Bar. This was especially helpful when we moved recently and we're eating them even more than usual. I love all the flavors, so it took a while for me to settle on my favorite. Just as I decided musical mango was my favorite, Jam Bar came out with a fifth flavor, Tropical Trio. This bar is like taking your taste buds on an exotic island escape. And it's definitely right up there with musical mango as my new favorite. These certified organic whole food bars are non GMO and gluten free and include vegan, dairy free options. Support your active life and your taste buds with Jam Bars. Available at Amazon, select retailers, and jambar.com. Well, this next question sort of goes along with that a little bit in that Chapter 6 on tribal languages, you say, supporting tribal language and culture also involves taking a good, hard look at oneself and community. This dynamic is especially challenging because it is language and culture revitalization that offer our greatest opportunities for strengthening political, economic, educational, and community health.
Mm-hmm.
So can you unpack that for us? I'd love to have you elaborate on the value that you see in culture revitalization, especially related to music, and your perspective on the importance that music holds for tribal vibrancy and prosperity.
Yeah. So first of all, in my own life, it has taken me a while to get to the point where I'm like, you know what? I love all of me. I think a lot of us have things that we have to work through, and our stories are unique unto ourselves, but there are threads in the human experience that are pretty common. In our modern educational system, like, we are so deeply impacted by colonization. Like, humans, sure, we've been mean to each other on every part of planet Earth throughout time. There's plenty of evidence of that. But colonization was a different kind of violence. It was one that said, you have to speak the language that I speak. You have to listen to the music that I listen to. You have to worship God the way that I worship God. And you have to speak the language that I speak. And if you don't do those things, you don't have a right to exist. So colonization, instead of fighting over resources or territory or whatever, it was about erasure. And
Erasure
if you think
of
about
identity.
erasure of identity and so forth, and every dimension of a colonial society was engineered that way. There are a couple takeaways. Like, one is, for those of us steeped in the culture of erasure, one of the greatest fears is fear of our own erasure. And it helps understand some of the things happening in American politics, for example. But it's more than that. Like, our educational systems are run in one language. It doesn't matter if it's wrapped up with kindness and postulated as opportunity. It's not holding up and validating everybody's language and everybody's culture, but one. And there's some regional variability to this, but I think nationwide, about 74% of America's teachers are white women. There's nothing wrong with being white, nothing wrong with being a woman, but the majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color. And I know that when I was going to school, even though I love education and I believe in education, I went all the way with my education. It took me a long time to come to terms with things because I never once had a teacher from my own racial group. K-12, college, master's, up to my PhD. And I think most white Americans have at least some teachers from their racial group. They might have all of their teachers be from their racial group. They're going to get almost all of their education in a colonial language, usually English. And I never had any of that. So education felt like an assault on my very identity and way of being. And often it wasn't the overt acts of meanness, although some of those happened too. It was the absent narratives. And the absent narratives were screaming at me, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. Because if we were important, relevant, or mattered, somebody would have said something in 13 years of a K-12 education. And so it does things to people. I felt like it was the continuation of an age-old assault, so I reacted with a big chip on my shoulder. A lot of times we're scratching our heads going, how come we have more truancy issues with minority folks? And to me, it's like exercising the flight response. How come we have more discipline issues? Fight response. And when you look at other data sets, like the states that tend to do well in state mandated tests are North Dakota and Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan. Do we see a pattern here? And the states with the worst racially predictable disparities in education are the same states. It's like the whiter the state, the whiter the curriculum, the whiter the body of teachers, the better the white students do, and the worse everybody else does. But we can't afford to have an education system that's like a white empowerment program. We have to educate everybody. And we are so diverse. The majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color. The racial predictability to graduation rates, when you consider that there is a racial predictability to graduation rates and that there is a strong correlation between educational attainment and financial prosperity. If we had perfect equity today, of course we don't, but pretend we did for a second, the educational system alone would engineer racially predictable financial disparity. And so something totally different happens when you center opportunity for people to learn about themselves as well as the rest of the world. So for example, in Hawaii, they started Hawaiian medium education using the tribal language as the language of instruction. The kids have to sing every day at the start of the school day outside of the school, asking for permission to come in the school. And then the staff sings back, and then everyone gets a hug from everybody who works there. Aloha. And I think in a mainstream school, we'd be thinking, are you serious? Like 45 minutes on cultural enrichment and music every day at the start of school every day? The kids are awake in the morning. Make them do math. Until you realize that at Navahi, which is the flagship Hawaiian medium school, they have a 100% graduation rate. Not just 100% of the kids who are in high school finish high school, 100% of the kindergartners make it all the way to the finish line.
Wow.
So if anyone else has data like that, they can give all the lectures. But until then, I think if somebody's figuring something out, we should just pay a little more attention to that. And what they do is they teach Hawaiian kids how to be Hawaiian and get curious about and explore the rest of the world. And a Hawaiian kid or a native kid going to school in a mainstream school is going to learn all about the wonderful things white folk did to make the world a beautiful place, and very little about native people and how they help make the world a wonderful place, even though they also help make the world a wonderful place.
Kind of going along with that, you ask a question in your book and then answer, why should tribal languages be important to everyone else? And one of the answers that you give, and this is a quote, tribal languages are the first languages of this land and the first languages of the first Americans. These facts alone should make their retention especially important, end quote. And again, I'm kind of thinking of music as one of those languages. But then you go on to talk about how there are proven links, which you just were talking about, between academic achievement and cultural and linguistic competency for Native youth. And the benefit to all of us is that if we have successful educational programs and academically successful Native youth, they are going to be the best possible neighbors and need fewer external resources. And so that's another reason that this matters to all of us. And then you say, but even more important, the survival of tribal languages and cultures is a test for the morality of our nation and its ability to provide for the needs of all of its citizens.
Right. Yeah, to me, obviously our country's having a hard time right now. It's the election, but it's not just the election. It's, can the system actually deliver the public goods that we expect for everybody? And as people are losing faith in the system itself, I think it causes some major structural and social stress. And for everybody in America, we're already at a time when the majority of the K-12 students are students of color, right? So it kind of doesn't matter, Democrats or Republicans, build a wall or don't build a wall, this is who is here. They're citizens. And not only are they going to be busy marrying each other and making babies and things like that over the years to come, but there's no way to like undo all of the humans moving around planet Earth, all of the colonization attempts, all of the things. Like 30% of the German population is born somewhere other than Germany. Diversity's everywhere. So we do have to figure out how to get along. But as this demographic change settles in America, everybody will have a minority experience. Everybody will have a minority racial experience. It might not feel like it right now, and it's going to take a few generations, but everybody will have a minority religious experience eventually. I was in Switzerland recently, and I was amazed to learn that I think it was 74% of the funerals are completely secular.
Wow.
No religious affiliation. I thought it would all be Catholic or Protestant, And, that trend is starting to envelop America. We're becoming less religious. We're having fewer babies later in life. A lot of these demographic trends, they will only continue. And so if you care about your race only or your religion only, then you should definitely care about the protection of minority rights and cultures and music, because that is yours.
Good point. Well, as I figured, I have way more questions for you than what we'll have time to go through.
That's all right.
I'll definitely include a link to your website in the show notes and a link to your book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, But Were Afraid to Ask. Like I mentioned, it's also available in a young readers edition, which is great because there's definitely historical information in there that's hard to read. And you may not want your young kids reading it, but, really necessary to understand that historical background of atrocities that happened in the forming of our country. Readers can read straight through the book. They can jump around and just use the table of contents to answer, find answers to specific questions that they're most interested. So really great resource. You also have a list of resources at the end of the book of recommended books, movies, things like that. Is the Rumble movie that you mentioned, is that on that list?
I'm not sure, but it should be.
Okay. Well,
I may have put it on there. Definitely relevant for, this podcast. And, for those listening in, I'm happy to stay in touch and in conversation with all of you. Feel free to click on the website. I've got a YouTube channel. There's hundreds of videos on all kinds of topics. It's an easy, free way to get more information, whether you're interested in land acknowledgements or the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday or whatever, you happen to be curious about. I'm very active with lots of public events, and some of those are virtual and some of those may be in a community near you. I travel extensively. Lots of books out. If you're an educator, we have free educator guides for the Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, But Were Afraid to Ask book posted on the website. Free educator guides for the new novel, Where Wolves Don't Die. They actually just sent out 20,000 copies of the Everything book to Minnesota educators and 10,000 copies of Where Wolves Don't Die. There are lots of ways to get the work in front of people, and I'm certainly happy to do my part to stay in touch with all of you.
Thank you. Yes. Well, you do have tons of those resources, that events tab on your website. So I'll definitely put those links in the show notes. Any other resources that are separate from your website that you want people to be aware of?
Oh, there are so many Native people raising their voices, writing, singing, traveling. I would say, just like you wouldn't want to get all your information about white folk from one white person, you'd want a variety of voices and perspectives and people of different ages, genders, and gender identities and all the things. Certainly take the same approach to Native stuff. Louise Erdrich just won a Pulitzer Prize. She's an amazing writer. Angeline Boulley just had a New York Times bestseller. If you want a Native authored thriller, there's so many people producing music and movies and shows. Reservation Dogs did really well, but there are lots of other ones too. So there's so many ways to get involved. And I think, honestly, if all we know is that we know enough to know there's a lot of stuff we don't know, then it's just time to lean in. Let's read a book. let's listen to some new music. Let's engage with our neighbors and, ask the questions.
Love it. One last question before I have you close things out with our coda, our ending. Here in the United States, the Thanksgiving holiday is coming up soon. Can you share your perspective with us on how we can honor Native Americans in our observance of this holiday? If there's certain maybe traditions or elements of the holiday celebration that tend to be problematic or offensive and we may not be aware of it, let us know about that. Or if there's I'm sure we could have a whole episode on this next portion, myths that are embedded in the holiday that you want to dispel for listeners. But any thoughts that you want to share with us before we wrap up on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. And, here too, I feel like I have a house full of natives and I don't even know what they're thinking half the time. I'm one person and I represent one person's view and perspective on things. So, with Thanksgiving, you may find different divergent perspectives from Native people. And it's good to engage with those multiple perspectives. But having said all of that, I do think most Americans get a very sugar-coated version of the first Thanksgiving. First of all, there are some elements of truth in the stories that you've heard. Native people, were quite abundant and living throughout the Northeast. But the first boatload of pilgrims who showed up not in a vacant wilderness, but at an existing native village site. And the natives ran away and the pilgrims stole their food. Then they built a pilgrim village where the native village was and started to displace the native population. There's no evidence of a shared native pilgrim harvest celebration until many years after pilgrim habitation in the Northeast. So that piece is a bit of mythology. But it is true that native people shared knowledge of indigenous culinary practices and farming practices, and it did make a difference in the survival of early pilgrim settlements. But there was an active genocide by the Puritans against the native population. It was rough and brutal, and there are many details that are kind of beyond the scope of today's conversation. At the end of what they sometimes called King Philip's War, the head Wampanoag chief, and this is the tribe that had at first befriended and assisted the pilgrims, he was killed and decapitated, and his head was placed on a pike at the village of Plymouth for 20 years.
By the pilgrims or the
By
colonists.
the pilgrims.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife and children sold into slavery and sent to the Caribbean to work on a sugarcane plantation until they were dead. Like, it was not always pretty and past the figgy puddings and stuff like that. But at the same time, you think about what Native people did share. Corn. It's in everything we eat, drink, and drive now. Potatoes and tomatoes and corn and squash and, so many things that transformed and brought us the uniquely American diet. It also transformed and brought us the Mediterranean diet and so many others. And so there's lots to learn about. I think it's interesting at the village of Plymouth today, there is still a meeting between the Native community and the descendants of the Pilgrim community on Thanksgiving.
Oh, really?
And they don't call it a Thanksgiving, they call it a day of remembrance. And it's not just a day of mourning, although some people will say we should frame it that way. It's not just a day of celebration or Thanksgiving, it's a day of remembrance. And I think that's a healthy tone for it. I get a time off from work, so I'm home with my family. We eat a bunch of food. We hang out and enjoy each other's company. I think it is good to practice gratitude, so we do that. But we also reflect upon the history, which is not only the ugly chapters, but it does include those ugly chapters. And I think we have to unpack the previous chapter so we can write the next healthy, happy, positive chapter. And that's what we're all about.
Thanks for that. And I'll throw in there too, when my kids were young, it didn't matter what holiday we were celebrating. I always, much to my kids' chagrin, always wanted to bring in the historical background of that holiday. So whether it was Halloween or Thanksgiving or Christmas or 4th of July, whatever the holiday was, I would try to bring in some sort of educational, historical information that I would go through with the kids so they knew why are we coloring Easter eggs at Easter time? Or where did this tradition of trick-or-treating come from? So I would encourage people, if you have young kids, get the Young Readers edition and just read with your kids through the sections on Thanksgiving. They're really easy to find in the table of contents. So just jump to those just to give your kids some more of that non-sugar coated historical background on the holiday. If your kids are older, or if you just want to read some more of this for yourself as an adult, get the regular version and read that so that you can go into our Thanksgiving holiday celebration more well-informed about the true history of that. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Treuer, for being our guest. I asked all my guests to close out our conversation with a musical ending, a coda, by sharing a song or story about a moment that music enhanced your life. Is there a song or story you can share with us today in closing?
There are so many ones that I could share. I did a collaboration with an artist named Thomas X, and I actually worked up kind of the intro Ojibwe language piece to frame his part, Resolution, which was kind of a call to action saying our reservation needs a revolution. And I thought it was a really well done piece to get us all thinking. So feel free to cue that up and share it with the team. Gawin wavin agade sinun mash gawaziwin gishpin mamigade sinuk. Onzam giwenj gagwad gituad betakosh gawandwa migadiwin manaba jituagwen ishkodewabu minwa zegiswajigadegin inakonigadegin gibakwa indwa gina amawindwa jimino bimadiziwad miajegwa goshkoziwad nishinabek da onishkawak. Giabigo bimi widuyang gidinwewin inan Indische Chigewin inanan, Giabi a beat tamang in the Kimenan, Gikanan Dislyang, Megwa in Goshkozimin, Megwa in Donishkamin, Gawin Giabi Gego Gikabitakushkago Sinan.
And that is Dr. Treuer's voice on the intro to Resolution, his collaboration with Thomas X. You can view the translation and full YouTube video in the show notes. I watched the documentary that Anton recommended, Rumble, The Indians Who Rock the World, and it was fantastic. It was available on Amazon. I'll put the link in the show notes, and it was really fascinating to learn about the musical contributions of Indigenous artists and how they influenced pop culture and music. Anton mentioned Jimi Hendrix and Link Wray. They're definitely featured in the documentary, as well as the Neville brothers. I'm a huge Aaron Neville fan and didn't realize the brothers had Native American heritage. So that was especially interesting for me to hear about. Other Native musicians worked with and highly influenced Rod Stewart, Ozzy Osbourne, Jackson Browne, and John Lennon, among others. So lots to learn in this documentary. Another thing Anton mentioned was that 87% of the educational standards in the U.S. that mention Native people are stories from before 1900. There is currently a campaign called Understand Native Minnesota that is donating 10,000 copies of Anton's Everything You Wanted to Know book to middle school and high school teachers and schools. If you'd like to get this book in your school or want to learn more about the program or find links to educator guides, just go to the show notes. Also in this week's show notes is information on November as Native American Heritage Month, news on Medicaid covering for the first time Native American traditional healing practices in 4 states, a transcript of today's episode, and related episodes you may enjoy. All Enhanced Life with Music episodes are evergreen, so be sure to check out the back catalog for more ways that music can make your life better. I hope this episode leaves you feeling inspired to learn more about and honor the Indigenous people and history and culture and music in your area, to honor them in your Thanksgiving celebrations if you're here in the U.S., and to utilize music to transcend divisions and find oneness and areas of commonality with your fellow Homo sapiens. In the spirit of Thanksgiving, I thank all of you for joining me on this journey of making life better individually and communally through the power of music. I love to hear from listeners. You can always connect with me on email, mindy@mpetersonmusic.com, Facebook, Instagram, X, or LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing the show. Until next time, may your life be enhanced with music.